Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose, first of all, I might just outline, because many probably people don't know me, that I've only recently joined EirGrid. But I've spent 20 years in the power industry in Ireland, so I have a good understanding of actually what's required in terms of building and delivering infrastructure. With the strategy that we've set out, and with the focus on decarbonisation, there's going to be a huge emphasis on actually reinforcing and adding on to the existing grid that we have in the island of Ireland. And to achieve that, we're going to have to engage with all of the communities that are going to be impacted and affected by that. So it's very, very important that as part of that engagement, we have a very clear plan and we know what we actually require, what we've got left between 2025 and 2030 to hit that target.
So in essence, to engage for better outcomes for all is ultimately the key thing that's going to decide whether this strategy is successful or not. Exactly. We can get all the engineering right, we can get all the connection offers out, but if we actually can't get the infrastructure built in a way that is as harmoniously as possible with the community, we won't achieve the target. Okay. Kate, your initial thoughts on the topic?
This is a big topic. I think that our planet is dying, and it's our only home. I think we all know that here, even though we don't like to face up to it. And it's dying because we're polluting it every day. And we know that we need to stop, and we need to stop very, very, very soon. I think that that means significant changes across all of our systems, how we move around, how we eat, how we power our lives. And EirGrid has a fundamental role to play in that, in making sure that the power that we use on a daily basis is the cleanest and the greenest that it can possibly be. I find it hard sometimes to be an Irish person because I'm like on Taoiseach, I'm not proud of our reputation as the laggards of Europe in terms of our ambition on climate action, and we need to change that really, really quickly. And when I look around and we talk about communities a lot, we talk about engaging people, we talk about acceptance. But what I think of the thousands, tens of thousands of children and students who took to the street last week in Ireland, in many cities, all over the world, to demand that we start to really take this very, very seriously and we start to act to reduce our emissions rapidly, and that means leaving almost all of the fossil fuels in the ground and powering ourselves with renewable energy, and that is a significant challenge, I accept, but it's one we have to absolutely do as soon as possible, and that will not happen, in my view, if it is done to people by others. What we need to do is we need to start talking about how do you do this with people and allowing people to participate, not just accept, but participate in the transition, the energy transition that we absolutely need to take. And Ireland, I think if we look around Ireland and we think of our communities, we actually excel at a community level. Probably our communities are one of our biggest strengths. We have tidy towns, we have GAA, we have school community groups, and people get involved at a community level all the time, and it's very, very positive and very successful. What we haven't managed to do in Ireland is we haven't managed to engage people at a community level in the energy transition and in climate action. And that, I feel, is fundamental and is essential if we're going to achieve this. And I think, and we can get onto this if you want a little bit later, but I think the reason that communities aren't participating in the energy transition yet is because the rules for communities to participate in the energy transition don't work. They do not work. They do not work if you want to put solar panels on your school. They do not want to work. They don't work if you want to do renewable energy in your farm. They don't work at a community scale. They don't work because it's hard to connect into the grid and it's hard to sell your power. It's actually almost impossible. And unless we can change those rules and get people participating in, investing in, looking up and seeing wind turbines spinning and knowing that they themselves are making a profit, making money out of that themselves, or their community is making money out of it, or they're benefiting from it, it's not all going offshore, then we've lost. And we're on a fine balance at the moment because we have fantastic wind that blows over our heads for free, and we have wonderful sunshine that falls on roofs, and we're not harnessing it yet enough. And I think we will harness it enough at the scale that we need if we are bringing people with us and doing it with people. And for me, the strategy here today is about engaging for better outcomes for all. Of course it's for better outcomes for all. It's for me, it's for you, it's for my 2-year-old daughter. It's for all of us, and it's not just here in Ireland, it's globally. It's a huge challenge, and I know everyone in the room here is aware of that. And actually, I hope that you all leave with the weight of that responsibility on your shoulders, because it's up to you to fix it. And I have faith that we can.
Thank you indeed, Kate. And Julie, would you like to pick up the gauntlet from where Kate has just put it down?
It's interesting. Kate and I hadn't talked beforehand about what we might talk about, even though we both sit on the Sustainable Energy Authority together. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a different kind of power. I was thinking about the power of why we do things rather than what we do. I think we've articulated very clearly, and it's set out in the strategy this morning, what needs to be done and the scale of the challenge that's facing us. But we really need to engage the hearts and minds of people and their limbic brain, the part of the brain where decisions are made, which is not necessarily about deep rational arguments. It's about getting people in the gut. And very much like Kate, I have 4 grandkids at this stage. My 6-year-old was born in China, and he said to me recently, Nai, why do we not have huge big wind farms here like they have in China? Why are we not using all our energy from the wind? And that's at 6. So our kids, our grandkids are talking to us about what needs to be done. They've got it. They've got the message. They believe in it. They've got the concern about the planet that we're going to leave them with. It seems to me that the challenge we have to meet at 2 ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, there's the very big, large-scale decisions that have to be made. To reach the volume of renewable energy production that we require at the moment is going to need massive changes in the grid. It's going to need greater interconnection. It's going to need a lot more wind input. Solar will certainly play a part. It will need us to begin to look much more closely at offshore wind as well as onshore wind, because we know some of the constraints that we're arriving at there. And I think the danger sometimes when we talk about the why is that we get very hooked on somebody out there, over there in Europe or elsewhere, is imposing an external target on us that we have to meet. That's not what this is about. This is about developing a country which is economically, socially and environmentally sustainable, not just for us, but for future generations. And it's about creating huge potential to be a place for growth. I know, among other things, I sit on the board of Ryanair. I know every company, even the most ruthlessly capitalist companies, are looking at how they can improve their carbon footprint. I think if we make Ireland a place which is at the forefront in terms of its use of renewable energy, apart from our contribution to saving the planet, we will be making an impact in terms of making this a good place to invest, a good place to do business, and a way of growing, and not just our own resources, but making us more self-reliant, which we clearly aren't in energy terms. So that's the big picture, the large scale. But at the small scale, the distributed generation and storage and sale of electricity is now inescapable. We heard this morning a lot of the opportunities that there are in that space. That's where individual consumers come in. That's where individual consumers, individual energy citizens begin to feel a sense of being able to control their own use of energy and their own way of engaging with energy. And I think it's in the interface between that big picture and what's happening in our own individual households, our own homes, our own schools, wherever, that this is where these two connect and come together, and people begin to feel a sense of control over their own destiny, over their own use of energy. And for that reason alone, even though the economic costs of microgeneration are higher than some of the costs of putting in the big grid arrangements and the larger networks, we have to facilitate that, because that's how we hook in individuals. We have begun to do some very good work in the Sustainable Energy Authority in the area of socioeconomics and understanding the way people think and feel. And again, it's back to the power of why. We need to make it a norm for people to behave in certain ways, to use their energies in certain ways. They need to begin to feel that they really value and are part of solving this problem. And we can only do that if we give power back into the hands of individuals and opportunities for them to engage directly. And I agree with Kate. I think I wouldn't be maybe quite so negative. I think we've made some very good progress in sustainable energy communities, for instance, and we're growing that network of communities, but we've still a long way to go to truly harness what I think is one of the huge strengths of Ireland, which is our capacity for community-led development, which we've been at the forefront of in all other aspects of life, from the GAA to Macra and Feirme to all the other bodies, urban and rural, around the country.
So, Thomas, Julie has just said there, the power needs to be in the hands of the people, but they don't just need to know how, but why. And do you think the agricultural community, how do you think that they would respond to that challenge the way it is now?
I suppose, like if we go back to the title in terms of engaging for better outcomes for all, one of your biggest challenges is going to be if you get a group of 40 Irish people, and this may be true for other people, but I won't comment on that. If you get 40 Irish people in the room, you're going to get 40 different outlooks on it. We are a very broad country in terms of our views, and particularly I can't speak to the urban population. I grew up in rural Ireland. I can't even speak to age demographics much higher than my own. I've had plenty of interactions with varying things when we've challenged them on outcomes. But the problem is you need to be able to have a message and engage with each of those groups individually. And to go back to one of the earlier talks, which said, I think it was that what works in Sligo won't necessarily work in Galway.
Liam said that in the last panel.
Yeah. And that's very true. But even inside of a community, you're going to have different interests, different outcomes. In terms of engaging with this, and in terms of generating your own energy, and again, to go back to Mark's kind of speech about, he highlighted the difference between two very different age profiles. There are some people who just want to turn on the switch and never want to engage and are quite happy with that and are quite happy with that. If you gave me a smart meter, I'd be fascinated by it and I'd want to be constantly watching it and I'd be tricking with it all the time because that's the nature of a lot of younger people as well. And a lot of younger people are far more engaged in this. And so you will have a different challenge, but by and large, engaging young people, I would say, in these forms of engagements on some of these projects has been very, very low. Certainly from the pictures that I've seen in terms of consultations, the average age is well the far side of 50. And while people are, and certainly the younger generation has been mentioned numerous times here, they will march. But when projects come to the local area, will their voice be listened to? Will it be encouraged on the same level? And that's going to be a big challenge if you want to get buy-in, because they're not homeowners and they're not, and possibly more importantly, and it was even mentioned in one of the videos, they're not voters. And so you're going to have this challenge. I think in terms of having better outcomes for everybody, you need to figure out what is a better outcome for each of those groups. And you also have to accept to a certain extent that there are some people who, no matter what argument you make, and no matter what outcome you offer, will simply not accept it. And I think we have to get better at accepting that we can't win over everybody. But what's more important is, rather than stimulating some age war between younger people who are more engaged with climate change and older people who are not, making sure that the communication and the actual wording and the messaging is right for both groups, to show one group that that they can trust in this technology, that it is the outcomes will be good, while simultaneously saying to the younger generation that you are actively engaging to try and reduce carbon footprint of our energy network and across the entire board.
Two things that I've taken from you all is, number one is the importance of communication, bringing people with you, arming people with knowledge, so that they know the power of why, as Julie said, so that they know what to do and so on. And the second thing is, you've all, in some ways, commented on the next generation. And they have been very prevalent in the videos mentioned this morning. Just like you said, Kate, they've been on the streets and so on like that. So maybe could I just, I'm going to go back to you on this one, Kate. How can we give young people an ability to create action as opposed to just words? Because at the moment they're using their voice and it's loud. But how do we empower them further? As you said, they don't have a vote, as Thomas said, and so on from there. So what do you think? How should we engage with the next generation, the next demographic, for action?
We just have to listen to them. The messages that are coming out from the school strikers is all very simple. It's all very clear. We have a carbon budget. We can't exceed it. It's basic mathematics. We can't afford to burn all of the carbon that exists in the world. We have to leave it in the ground. We can't afford to have the methane coming out of the agricultural system that we have. We need to find alternative ways. So young people are very powerful, and they're starting to engage with politics, and that's great, because a lot of the changes that have to happen at a system level. They have to happen to make it easier for everybody else to do things in a greener way. And if we just take the electricity sector, for example, it's really easy to see that. If we take the fossil fuels off the electricity system, every time we if we change and we have an electric car, if we have a heat pump, everything that we do when we use electricity is less impactful. So there are systematic changes, but it's also about allowing people to participate in that action or in that change in themselves and within their own community. So I think it's just about listening, but it's also about really responding. And I think in Ireland we've been slow. We haven't really made the systematic changes that we need to really, really reduce our carbon emissions in a fast way. We're starting to see change in that. I'm actually feeling more hopeful than I ever have these days about our prospects for the future. And I think most of that is coming from the fact that I think that people are starting to really get it, that this is serious, that we all need to, it's not just about switching off your light and doing those little tiny things in your own life, which are important and we should all do, but it's about coming together and doing things collectively.
Michael, Brian Cox said this morning is that it's not the consumption of energy that is the issue, but it's the production of it. As Kate said, it's about where it's coming from, whether it's fossil fuels or whatever else. So in order to create the world that Kate has just described there, where it's all electric vehicles, or we'll say where in essence, we'll just, actually I'll refer back to what Mark said about, heat and transport being powered by electricity. You are going to be one of the key people who's going to have to make this happen with other people. So Mark described the outcomes this morning, the key targets about what needs to happen. But what needs to happen in order for that to happen? In other words, what does the journey for the next 10 years look like when it comes to grid, when it comes to stuff that we probably don't really want to know about, but we should?
For us to hit 10,000 megawatts of additional renewable generation, we need to maximise the existing infrastructure we have. We need to sweat that asset, and we need to use innovation in the centre to actually try and get every single megawatt we can out of the infrastructure we have. And a lot of effort has gone on in the last few years to identify new ways of maximising that. But there's an inevitability that to connect all the new generation we require and to enhance and provide a secure grid that can actually deal with the additional renewable generation, which can go up and down when it's a windy or not so windy day. Very simply, we need new infrastructure.
Do we need much of it? Let's call a spade a spade.
We have 7,000 kilometres of transmission system running across the island of Ireland. A lot of it's been there for a long time. We have a huge step change in the level of renewable generation, but it's not on the same scale in terms of building new infrastructure. So it's not going to double. We are going to have an increase. It really depends on where the new generation is going to come from. If a lot's coming from onshore, we'll have to connect that up. Offshore, and then what's going to come through the distribution system. But it's a combination in that situation of ESB working together with EirGrid to maximise the infrastructure that's there and to try and build out on that.
So in essence, we need to sweat the assets of what is there, and that ultimately what needs to come isn't as much as what's there again.
Exactly.
Right, Thomas. So we're talking about sweating the assets of infrastructure here. How do we sweat the assets of relationships? How do we get the best outcome for everybody? Or is it like, to be fair, you've had a fair 2 weeks of negotiations yourself, and you all know what I'm talking about. So an awful lot about trying to come to a compromise. So how do you think that this approach should be taken from the point of view of trying to get the best outcome for as many people as possible?
Again, I think it goes back, and it goes back to, there was a mention of sociology, and I think that probably hasn't played enough of a role. I think perhaps the engineering side of it, and there was a lot of talk, and I can't comment on the technical side of it. I'm not an engineer. I studied as Brian Cox would describe it, the squishy stuff, biology, as opposed to the technical and the engineering. Even more squishy stuff is how people feel about things. And certainly my perception of an installation of, let's say, wind turbines would be very different to my parents' perception of it, because they've grown up with a particular landscape and how they view it. I might perceive it in one way, I may have other concerns. Maybe it'll be about the impact to the local economy. Maybe, and when we did discuss it, one of the things that I think is very, very challenging, whether you're talking about installing, the other infrastructure, or you're installing about wind, or you're installing even the larger solar or AD plants, is the perception of how that's going to deal with the community, but also then in terms of the only 100% solid outcome will that be will be the likes of devaluation of property and how that affects property and disruption, because
That's a big deal.
it's a massive
Devaluation
deal.
is a big deal.
It's a massive deal, and there are a lot of steps you can take in terms of addressing the perception in other ways. But if there's going to be an impact on devaluation of property, you have to have some proper outcome. Exactly what that is, I'm not entirely sure. That isn't my area. I know that what you need to do though is you first need to ask, look, what do you want? What do you stakeholders? What is your major objection? Instead of assuming that it's either some form of anti-everything approach, or it's a not in my backyard approach. There are going to be people who are going to object no matter what you do, in the same way that we had with the talks. There's always a certain percentage who will oppose something. The question is how you split those people out from people who have genuine concerns, and then try to figure out how to address those concerns as best you can. Certainly for younger people, one of the biggest things is and one of the biggest selling points, again going back to what Kate was saying in terms of outcomes to the community, is employment, and that's whether it be the installation or whether the actual running of it. I mean, one of the things that always stands out to me is just how much fossil fuel we buy into this country. There is no employment being generated for Ireland in the extraction of fossil fuels in Saudi Arabia or in the Russian gas fields, but there could be in the future in terms of whatever renewable energy that you're talking about in Ireland. And that's going to be key to because particularly in rural Ireland, we are facing into a lot of changes, and one of the biggest changes is going to be more employment in Dublin. I know IDA are working quite hard, but at the same time, it's unavoidable that the new tech economy is mostly focused around the hubs, less so about rural Ireland. How do we train people in terms of being part of this new economy, this new energy economy, as opposed to simply saying, well, we're going to put all that in Dublin?
And Julie, you have a lot of experience in understanding all of these various different areas, particularly given your own background. What do we need to do right to make this a real success?
I think we need to tackle it at a whole lot of different levels. There is the big message that we've talked about in terms of the risk to the future of the planet. And I was struck by a comment in the last panel session about how countries are extremely good at innovation when they're on a war footing. And in a sense, we need to start thinking of ourselves as being on a war footing in this case.
Leo had mentioned that point.
Yeah, I spent 37 years in the Irish Civil Service, and I discovered that we made all our best and sharpest and fast decisions when there was a crisis. When there was no crisis, things get just a little bit loose and sloppy. So I think there is a growing sense of crisis about this issue worldwide, shared by young people and increasingly understood by all the other generations. And that's why, like Kate, I feel more hopeful now than I did before. But people respond, and I love that phrase, the squishy stuff. I missed that presentation this morning, but I think the squishy stuff is really important. We need to do all the economic and scientific analysis around all this, but we have to get it at that kind of squishy level. And people respond at different levels. Yes, they can respond in that deep gut way to the big picture and to the challenge facing the planet. But they also respond to what impacts them in terms of the economics of their own home, their own household, their own pocket, the value of their property. What strikes me about this is there's a huge potential win-win here if we get this right. Because what we're talking about is creating local economies, rural and urban, that are more self-sustainable in all sorts of ways. We're talking about all sorts of supply chain opportunities here within Ireland that we didn't have before, when all of our, the vast bulk of our energy was imported fossil fuels. We're talking about creating more resilient and self-sufficient local economies. So I think we need to get to people, on the one hand, at the level of me, in my house, in my home, with my energy consumption. How can I do it better, more efficiently, cheaper? Which is where I think that distributed access to energy becomes very important, electricity becomes very important. I think at the level of communities, one of the things, and it resonates with Thomas's point, which is that when you ask somebody, how many people does it take to lead community action? They're inclined to think it needs the whole parish, the whole neighbourhood, everybody. Sometimes it just needs 5 or 10 people.
Well, Greta Thunberg,
Well,
certainly proven
but
that
5 or
last year.
10 committed people in a community can really lead change. And there are opportunities coming up in the renewable energies, new electricity support scheme. We already have opportunities for community benefit funds, but I think opportunities for local communities either to lead investment directly themselves or to partner in those investments is going to be there. And I think the critical thing, and one of the barriers, apart from all the barriers that Kate has mentioned, is the information barrier. Because if I'm trying to make a choice, for instance, between putting a PV solar panel on my own roof or investing in a wind turbine down the road, at the moment, I'm not sure I have the information available to me to decide what's the best choice for me. So I think there is a role for organisations like my own, Sustainable Energy Authority, in being honest brokers in the provision of information directly, or supporting people in getting access to the right kind of information to make the best decisions in the interests of their communities, whether that's to engage in a community benefit fund, to partner, to invest directly in some cases, or indeed simply to retrofit their own homes. And I think we've a lot to just bridge that gap between, we've got people in a lot of cases to a willingness to do something, but they're not always entirely sure what the right something is.
So the willingness is there, the ability may or may not, whether it is through
Yeah.
prevention, as Kate said earlier, from maybe an actual barrier or simply a knowledge one. I had asked the team to share the questions up here, and as you can see that there's a range of them up here. We're also now just going to open up the room as well, 2 questions. So I believe that there are roving mics. If you could just put up your hand, anybody who wants to ask a question. I see that we have a hand put straight up here. So while the mic is coming up, I'm just going to ask, let me see, which one? Well, Kate, there's one there directly addressed to you, so we'll start there. Kate, I know these are the Taoiseach's words, but how can you call us laggards when we have a power system with 65% SNSP and a target of 70% renewable generation? We're getting there, but the term laggard is offensive to the good work that has been done to date. So,
Yeah, I don't like
discuss.
it as a word, but I think it's true, unfortunately. And if we try and pit each sector against each other, see who's doing better or worse, we're probably failing already. The reality is that Ireland is one of the only countries in Europe that's not going to meet its 2020 targets. We are second, third, bottom in terms of our per capita emissions in Europe. We are extremely polluting people on a per capita basis across every metric that you can measure. So we're not doing great. And we might have ambition now, which I think we should raise our ambition. Ambition is important, but what we need to see is actual implementation. We need to see emissions falling in Ireland, and they're not, and actually they're projected to continue to rise in the short term. So we need to start implementing across a system level ways of reducing our emissions today. And we can't just wait until 2030 and hope that we'll be able to do it in 2029. It has to be on an ongoing basis. We need to start seeing our emissions falling, and Ireland is not performing well on a European level or on a global level.
And ultimately, that is why we're here today, exactly, is because that is the issue there, and the strategy is there and hard metrics there in order to test. So it'll be very interesting over the next year, and Michael and your colleagues before you as well have said that there are yearly targets now, so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out over time. I'm going to take the question here. Would you mind just saying your name, where you're from, and maybe who you're addressing this question to?
Okay, it's Brian O'Gallagher from MARI, which is the SFI Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. And it's a question about the role of sociology, so it picks up on Thomas's point.
Okay.
We have a situation where, as Michael mentioned, there is this strategy now, and there's a desire to have or to secure buy-in from communities. And as Kate mentioned, there's also communities that are trying to do something and see the barriers in terms of their ambitions being realised. And we have these parallel things happening where, in one sense, one sees the other as part of the problem. So we're really not getting the engagement piece right at all, because those things are happening in parallel. And Paddy Hayes mentioned in the previous session that the project down in Dingle, I think, is very interesting, and Mara is supporting that work in terms of trying to understand the societal dynamics. So there's huge engineering challenges, there's economic challenges, but the societal dynamics are really where this is where the big challenge is, and that's been recognised by the panel. But we really need to understand more about those societal dynamics, and we're only scratching the surface. We do, interestingly, have a world-leading start in this area with the Citizens' Assembly. So we are developing, in certain levels, new ways of having discourse. And it moves, I mean, Thomas mentioned you could have 40 people with different views and different perspectives, but finding ways of actually having discourse so that those 40 people could agree on something, which is what the Citizens' Assembly did with 100 people from different backgrounds. Those are the type of things that we need to try and tap in, but expand in terms of around the country into communities. So find new ways of discourse, be open to the need for compromise, and to try and move towards a more cohesive perspective than seeing one as the challenge to ourselves from whatever perspective we're in.
So it was a comment, not a question. That's okay, honey. I just wanted to make
Yes.
sure. Was there a question you wanted to put?
Well, it's really what are people's thoughts on that?
Right.
That need for new methods of engaging. You know, because that's where I think there's a research dimension to this. There's a challenge dimension to this. We don't know. We haven't solved, in my view. So I want to see if the panel agree with that. How to engage?
Okay. Well, it's a very fair. And Julie and Michael, you're both there looking like you both would like to answer. So, ladies first, Julie.
Well, first of all, I agree with the comment. Our behavioural economics unit in Sustainable Energy Authority is beginning to undertake various different types of action research, and I think can provide a good focal point for getting a better handle on what happens in practice. And I suppose the advantage we have with the SEAI is that we do directly fund a lot of supports, including the sustainable energy communities, but they are also a really rich test bed for what works. Like you, I was hugely impressed by the Citizens' Assembly, and because it's grounded in what we're good at in Ireland. We're good talkers, we're good at getting together, and I think it's produced some very powerful results. I think it's really important with these issues, when we have the conversation at a national level, most people get it. Where the rubber hits the road is when it comes down to a local community, and that wind turbine is going up there in my backyard, or that piece of grid is coming across my land or close by. So I think we have to continue that engagement as much as we can at local level, and particularly focus on how we can learn improving the dynamics at a more local level and what the barriers are there.
So there's a huge amount of behavioural, we say, research that we can glean insights from, and when we combine that with what we're really good at here in Ireland, there really is a way forward. Mm-hmm. Michael?
I agree completely with what Brian is kind of suggesting at its core, and I'm quite familiar with the Dingle project and the benefits of actually that kind of engagement. And again, it goes back to there is no one size that fits all, and every community is different, and there's a kind of a particular dynamic there that we need to engage with. I'm very encouraged by the steps that the EirGrid team have put in the last number of years in terms of community engagement, which is really focused on putting the people who are going to be affected by something right in the heart of the actual design of the solution, as opposed to coming up with a solution and coming on later. I also see huge benefits in terms of actually having people out on the ground locally in terms of community liaison officers and agricultural liaison officers, so that we can actually get a feel and a better understanding, because it's not just up to a team in Shelburne Road to really come up with a proper understanding of the effects that piece of infrastructure or something's going to have in rural Ireland. I think the other comment, maybe say and be very open about it, is that I suppose, like, I'm an engineer, and sometimes it's challenging for an engineer actually to get across the kind of message in non-engineering terms. And I was thinking about it earlier on when Mark had a picture that his nephew, I think Leo, drew, and like the picture said everything. But as an engineer, if we're going to create that picture, I'll be focused on showing how that iceberg that the penguin is sitting on is actually supported by all the ice underneath, and the 9/10, 1/10, and we get focused on something like that, Whereas the whole concept in sociology is actually trying to translate that down into kind of simple, plain English and relevant to the relevant people that we're actually engaging with. So it's core. And the other bit I might just pick up on is in terms of the microgeneration. I see a lot of hope from the Climate Action Plan. It has clear targets for EirGrid, for ESB, for the developers, for everyone in this room, for the CRU, for the departments as well. And as part of that, I think that's a starting point. We're building our strategy out to actually go and deliver that. I think we all need to work together in partnership to try and figure out how we grow that. But something in terms of microgeneration, when you think about that from our point of view, it's a huge, important thing in terms of engaging with local communities and actually delivering in terms of the Climate Action Plan. But at the same time, by 2030, we're probably looking at 450 megawatts of generation from microgeneration. But we really need the big wind, the big solar, and the big offshore to bring on the other 9,500 megawatts. But maybe there's an opportunity to put the two together and use that for community engagement, so that actually the community has a sense of contributing to that, as well as actually helping to deliver the other 9,500 megawatts that we're going to be missing.
I think that's a great point, is that microgeneration has a role, and we also need to think bigger, and EirGrid and ESB and the TSO and DSO relationship and the suppliers can go and implement it all. I think there's a question down here that's on everybody's mind, and Thomas, I'm going to ask you for this, and that is, how do we link support for climate emergency with the need for communities to support renewables? We see people who strike for climate change but then oppose wind farms. And this is the issue. I mean, Kate said earlier, and I'm quoting her now, but she says, this can't be done to people by others. So how is it that people can say they want one thing, but if a hole is dug with a view to a piece of grid or a piece of infrastructure there, and then people will, say, go out and protest against it? And of course, everyone has a right to protest, of course. But just that saying and doing, they sometimes clash. And that's going to be a challenge that EirGrid has, for sure. How would you like maybe to comment on that?
I suppose the first thing I have to say, I didn't strike for climate, not least because the last one we were still recovering from the talks and the ploughing, actually. But I have spoken to people who have gone striking. I don't know, I won't comment on the veracity or the accuracy of saying someone who strikes for climate is also willing to oppose wind farms. The ones I have met certainly would not be the case. Those younger people, and I think the general attitude towards renewable energies is also more positive, even when there is a visual impact amongst younger people. Someone once said to me that anything that is new before you're 19 is exciting. Anything that's new to you before you're 35 is an employment opportunity, and anything that's new after 35 is scary. And I think there is a certain element of that. I haven't hit 35 quite yet.
We were all wondering that, actually.
Yeah, I can comment on that later on. But how we tie the message of climate change back to people is really, really important to me, because in the agricultural community, we have a big challenge in terms of communicating climate change.
Yes, sorry. Yep. On that note, the very last comment there is definitely agreed that there is an information gap, even at basic levels, on what can be recycled or not. Any suggestions on how this barrier can be overcome, since you're at it?
So I suppose that certainly in the agricultural community and in the wider rural community, exactly what Kate is saying, things being done to us. People see the argument of climate change less so now, which is great, but certainly for an older generation. And for most of the time that I've been talking about climate change, people have been talking about this being something external to them, something which is a little bit distant. And I think part of the problem with that, and I'll be honest, is the messaging of some of the green groups, not to attack Kate or any other member of the green group, but it has sometimes been that. It's been the big things, it's been the penguin on the icebergs. When I'm communicating to trying to explain to farmers why we should have actions about climate change, and the same message would be applicable to the energy community, I don't talk about polar bears. I quite frankly tell them I don't give a damn about polar bears. It's not entirely true. I do like polar bears. But polar bears are not going to motivate someone to change a practice on their farm. What you have to do is communicate it differently. So for a lot of my guys, what I say is, We have two major greenhouse gases. It's not CO2, it's nitrous oxide and methane in agriculture. And while they're a little bit more complicated to compare to CO2, they're still greenhouse gases. They're quite important and significant elements of it. So what I say to them is, I say, don't worry about methane for a climate change point of view necessarily. Worry about it because you've spent money on feed, which an animal has now converted and wasted into methane. With nitrous oxide emissions, you've bought fertilizer and you've now let it go up into the sky. So the same sort of language maybe will work better in terms of how you encourage people to say, this is an opportunity maybe for your kids to get employment. This is an opportunity for your local communities to grow, particularly when we're talking about microgeneration. But also some of the bigger companies, some of the bigger projects will generate investment. I went to an IT, that's where I got my bachelor's, then before I got my master's. And one of the things I suppose that influences me is that IT was underneath a giant wind turbine. I went to Dundalk, there's been a wind turbine turning there for decades now. We walked underneath it every single time. We didn't think, you didn't really look up, to be honest. It was there and it made a bit of a noise, and the bar was quite close to it. I think they shut the bar since. But it was just there, and because we were getting the message of, this is a place for future employment, that was how we maybe looked at renewables, and trying to bring this back down to the personal level. But you are still going to have a challenge with those people who are plus 35 and people who, you know, particularly say on the tourist aspect of things, because there's going to be a visual impact, and as I've said already, on the in terms of their property devaluation. But for everybody else, being able to make it clear to them that there's a benefit to them personally, and then there's this greater benefit to climate change is really, really important.
I see that there's a range of other questions coming in there, and certainly you'll be able to see them all as they're scrolling. Sorry, I am just going to give the last word to this lady here. If you'd like to ask the last question.
Great, thank you. I'm Jean Moore from the National Economic and Social Council. A comment and a question.
Sure.
The comment is we did some work called community engagement in the wind sector, and it basically has a model for community engagement and a number of recommendations. And for people that don't know it, on the NESC website, it comes up with some very practical suggestions about involving intermediaries and experts, bringing that knowledge about types of engagement, about that sense of bringing local value to communities and having them share in that local value. And the question is really, we're doing our work on this idea of a just transition, and thinking about the way that climate action has to be fair and equitable. I'm just wondering, would the panel agree with me that community energy offers one of the key, I suppose, linchpins of connecting that idea of a fair, transition towards a low-carbon transition, and something that has potential for rural Ireland, and this idea of resilience that Julie mentioned, this idea of jobs. I think there's a critical role for communities to have at their fingertips, this microgeneration, opportunities for job development, and maybe that's something that we could just emphasize more as we're talking about climate action, is building on some of these ideas. And just have you thought about how to link it to this idea of a just transition? Thank you.
I'm just going to put that to Julie, if that's okay. And Julie, we'll wrap up on this. Thank you all for your questions. Clearly we could go on, but Julie, you were vigorously nodding in response to that.
I totally agree with that. I was just looking at some of the questions coming up about, is it not enough that people get the benefit within their area? Why should we have to pay to encourage communities to get involved, or something on those lines? And it just seems to me that very often what happens in Ireland is those that perceive themselves to be the victims of things being done to them are not necessarily those that benefit from the impact for the economy and society as a whole of the changes that are taking place. So we've got to get that link in place at local level. And I do think that community engagement piece is absolutely vital as part of the just transition. I think more work needs to be done on the just transition. I think it'll come up in the context of carbon tax as well. We need to get a better handle of where some of the disproportionate negative impacts might fall. Because I saw another question of, can we afford to do this? My feeling is we can't afford not to do this. We can't afford not to make this change. This change is as radical in its way as rural electrification was, but also it has a huge opportunity and prize at the end of it. And if we can just find a way at local and community level of embracing the opportunities, and not just, and Thomas has articulated beautifully, not just seen it as a threat, and that does have to come down to what impact is this going to have on me, in my life, in my world, in my community, and not just but as well as what impact is it going to have on the planet.
Well, I think that we got, a great, good conversation out of that. So can I ask you all, please, to put your hands together for Kate Ruddock, Friends of the Earth, Thomas Duffy, President of Macra and Feirme, Julie O'Neill and Michael Mahon, EirGrid. Thank you.